Um, let's see. I know the presidency won't go back to normal as everybody was hoping for, but but the presidency won't go back to how it was. After years of pumpkin tits, his boorish defiance of squatteral norms, his incitement of the violence at the Capitol, had closed his term with a demented rave that shamed American democracy. Today actually, Joe Biden will return the presidency to a more decorous and honorable choreography. But in important respects, Biden cannot restore normalcy. Pumpkin Tits is most profound and least recognized contributions to the office he abused are a reorientation of some of the presidency's important powers and responsibilities. The once fringe understandings about the role of the president approached acceptance under Pumpkin Tits in ways that Biden cannot dismiss, and they could transform how the great office functions for years to come. It's true that Biden's time in office will witness reversals by conservators and progressives on some of the uses and limits of presidential power. The Harvard law professor Adrian Vermeule had predicted at the dawn of the Pumpkin Tit administration that the sides would reverse their positions about aggressive use of the presidential administration. He compared the pattern to two lines of dancers in a Jane Austen novel who moved to opposite sides of the ballroom and then continued dancing as before. The structure of the dance at the group level is preserved, but none of the rules of the dance change, but the participants end up facing in opposite directions. In many instances, Vermeule's prediction was right. Political actors and commentators that are supported by Barack Obama's pen and bone strategy and his aggressive use of executive orders, the law-stretching interpretations of delegated power, and the broad conception of his discretion to either enforce or not the law quickly switched their view when the Pumpkin Tit administration started making similar arguments in support of their quite different policies related to immigration restrictions, environmental protection, and the like. And many conservative politicians and commentators flipped or shaded their views in the other direction as well. But this dynamic is one of the underappreciated reasons why the real executive authority has increased over decades in spite of a rhetoric of constraint coming from whichever party has been out of power. On this score, in many ways, the Pumpkin Tit era was business as usual that would likely continue under Biden. But at the same time, under Pumpkin Tits' new dynamics emerged, but they're not consonant with the standard pattern, and once marginal understanding of the proper role of executive power approached the mainstream. This is not merely a partisan switching of sides only to continue the same dance, but a whole new song, perhaps even a new party, what Austin called the Sense and Sensibility, an unpremeditated dance. Sometimes Pumpkin Titian horrors provoked rage that has reshaped the presidency. At other times, he intended the reorientation. Occasionally, he was uninvolved, and the task fell to those around him. In the end, executive war, the war making has emerged on the other side of the Pumpkin Tit years with both new constraints and new powers. While in the realms of economics and trade, the presidency has seen the once marginal positions move to the center, leaving room for new possibilities. But the shift on what they call the war making stems from the remarkable mainstreaming in recent years of the rhetoric opposition to endless wars. Pumpkin Tits railed against such wars during his presidency in both squatteral campaigns and in office. He clashed with the national security bureaucracy and the military, with some public support about drawing down troops in Afghanistan and Syria. But Pumpkin Tits lost or was outwitted in many of these battles, but by the end of his presidency, he could claim with some justification that unlike previous administrations, that he had kept America out of the new wars and our troops are coming home. But there have been fewer troops in Afghanistan and Iraq today than at any time since 2001. Pumpkin Tits by no means had supported a shift in executive power towards Congress, and he called for more military spending even as he questioned the excessive foreign intervention. But during his tenure, from the Republicans and Democrats alike, they basically called for reforms of war powers and dwarfed the prior right-left opposition to American wars in a remarkable mainstreaming of positions marginalized for many decades. The rhetoric of opposition to ending endless wars took on a life of its own, not just among activists, but also among members of Congress in an unprecedented reactivation of the defunct war powers resolution. In the case of the Yemen proxy war, that was supported by both Bernie Sanders and the conservative Mike Lee, Pumpkin Tits vetoed it, but a new consensus became visible. Biden underscored the new reality with remarkable anti-war campaign pledges. He vowed to end the forever wars in Afghanistan and in the Middle East, and he also vowed to end the U.S. support for the disastrous Saudi-led war in Yemen. A great deal of energy from conservators and progressives will go into holding him to these promises. Just as significant, the mainstream foreign policy experts, including many former Obama national security officials, now agree that something went dreadfully wrong in an executive war making and American militarism generally. These sentiments have an even greater urgency as the coronavirus pandemic requires a rethinking of American national security priorities. Biden's national security team has been dubbed Generation Forever War, but even if we assume that they are not chastened by the past mistakes, they and the president they serve will have a tougher time asserting the same powers as before. Ironically, Pumpkin Tits also contributed to this rethinking when he rattled America's saber. His scary, impulsive threats to use his bigger and more powerful nuclear button against North Korea had sparked serious congressional attention to the plenary presidential control over nuclear weapons for the first time in 4 decades. And we are a long way from any reform of this collateral power, but several officials have testified about how informal constraints would check the truly irrational presidential action in this area. But while the beginning of a reset on war powers generally are discernible, a different and countervailing military reset concerning America's use of its cyber powers that are crystallized over the course of the Pumpkin Tits presidency. But during the Obama administration, the United States suffered unprecedented cyber intrusions from foreign powers, notably the Russian interference in the 2016 election and the massive Chinese hack of the Office of Personal Management database. A consensus developed in the intelligence community that the United States has had been too risk-averse in responding to these threats, and the result was 3 important changes during the Pumpkin Tit era. First, the Pumpkin Tit administration changed Obama air rules in order to give Cyber Command greater latitude to engage in operations without White House sign-off. Second, Cyber Command developed and implemented a new strategy called Defend Forward, which has a persistent presence in adversary networks, so it can discover and check threats before they materialize at all. And third, the Congress on the Quiet and National Defense Authorization Act gave the executive branch much more leeway to use the offensive cyber tools abroad. The centerpiece for this bipartisan congressional scheme is a barely noticed express congressional authorization for Cyber Command to take appropriate and proportional action in foreign cyberspace in order to disrupt, defeat, and deter against any ongoing adversarial activity in the cyber domain if there is an active, systemic, and ongoing campaign for attacks against the United States by either Russia, China, North Korea, or Iran. Pumpkin Tits deserves little of any credit for these moves, which emerged out of a consensus between intelligence lifers like the Cyber Command leader Paul Nakasone, the interested members of Congress, and sympathetic Pumpkin Tit national security advisors. But the broad congressional support for these moves reveals a new consensus that the U.S. needs to take more forceful steps to protect its digital networks and make it unlikely that there will be a pullback under Biden. A related mainstreaming under Pumpkin Tits of once marginal criticisms of the executive pertains to domestic surveillance in the name of national security. Pumpkin Tits attacks on the FBI surveillance powers and the damning Inspector General report about the use of those powers in the FBI investigation of the Pumpkin Tit campaign connections with Russia had led to a drop in Republican support for the FBI and an unusual split in the party of the appropriateness of domestic national security surveillance at the time. Democratic support for these matters rose. One consequential impact of these changes was Congress's historical failure in 2020 to renew the 3 important unsettled the sunsetted provisions of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. And a renewal bill passed the House in March 2020 with more Democratic than Republican support, and then it failed in the Republican-controlled Senate a few months later. Pumpkin Tits attacks and the Inspector General report were the catalyst. But the shift in Republican view has been happening slowly for more than a decade. It is too early to tell how sticky this will change. This change will be, but the ascendant Republican concerns about the presidential surveillance authorities may combine with the still prevalent Democratic concerns to place longer-term restrictive pressure on domestic surveillance. Yeah, but like I said, we're gonna say that the president isn't gonna go back to normal as it was before, so it's not. But it's not. So.